happy to be part of this conference. My paper is Finding Our Voice, The Road to 1888 and Beyond. It begins after the morning of October 22, 1844. The little flock was without safe harbor. In Port Gibson, New York, there was a group of people, Hiram Etzen, his protege O.R.L. Kreuzer, and his doctor friend, Dr. Frank B. Hahn. They had gone through quite a struggle that night. And there in the morning, they had said, or Hiram Etzen had written that, we had wept till day dawn. And there in their barn, they had prayer asking God to show them where they were, what had happened, what's going on. And after breakfast, Hiram Etzen decided he would go find some other Adventists in town and comfort them. And so they passed through the cornfield by the house, and as he was passing through, O.R.L. Kreuzer was with him. He was up ahead. He looked back. He saw Hiram standing there in the field, and he asked him if there was a problem. And Hiram said, I'm receiving an answer to this morning's prayer. He says, and it was in his mind's eye. He didn't have a prophecy. This wasn't something that like a prophet would get. This has sometimes been presented this way. I think it's just that the light went off over the top of his head. And he saw in his mind's eye that Jesus had went into the heavenly sanctuary, that the earth was not the sanctuary. He went into the heavenly sanctuary there to do a work before he came back. And so this was the beginning of what would be known as the sanctuary doctrine. Over a period of about 6 months, O.R.L. Kreuzer and Hahn and Hiram Etzen had studied this out, and they come up with a paper, published it in their little paper called The Day Dawn. Now, The Day Dawn only had about 300 circulation. It didn't have much impact. And about a year later, they enlarged the article, called it The Law of Moses, and put it into a special issue of the Day Star. It had almost 3,000, maybe 4,000 distribution. And so with that, a little bit more of an impact on the Adventist community. In fact, this was the article that Ellen White would later say she could recommend for those looking for answers to what happened in 1844. And it just so happened that this special issue came out between two of the standard issues where Ellen White's letter had been published regarding her first vision. The first one had been sent out. She told him not to publish, but he did. And this was in the paper Day Star. The editor was Enoch Jacobs. It had been known as the Midnight Cry during the Millerite movement. And he published it, and she sent another letter explaining some of the details since he published it, and she needed to further explain. And so between these two editions was the special edition of the Day Star with the Law of Moses. That became the standard because the first one, there in the Day Dawn, had not been extant for many, many decades. In fact, it wasn't until there in the 90s that Merlin Burt of the Center for Adventist Research had discovered it there in Canandaigua, and now we have it back to us restored. But for the longest time, it was just this one article. Later, we understood Miller had preached the Three Angels' messages. He only preached the first two. And we began to realize afterwards that there was a third one yet to go out. And we figured, well, this is the tarrying time. And there was a debate over how this would be understood. And there was a great story on it in Knight's book about how Bates and James White had begun to understand the Three Angels' messages and come to its conclusion that the messages, all three are to be preached, and that they're all out there. It's not like one starts and ends and then the other one starts. They all continue to the end of time. And so the message began to be understood at this time. But this was a time when we were preaching the third message to Adventists. We had figured that after the Millerite movement, the door of mercy had been closed, and that all our cause was to minister to those within the faith to keep them from falling. But it was during the late 40s, about 48 to 50, we began to gather together in conferences, and through those we hammered out what would be our four pillar doctrines. And in 1851, we began to have converts. And it's interesting because in 1851, Joseph Harvey Wagner converted to Adventism, and he had not been part of the 44 movement. Now this really took them aback and realized that the message is greater than what they had thought. And this was the beginning then of what was called the gathering time. The truths that set out at this time was what was made Adventists different from other Christians. And this was asking the question, as George Knight says in his book, what was Adventist in Adventism? And because we figured Christians already had the gospel, and so we didn't emphasize that. And so over a period of about 40 years, I think we seem to have lost our voice on the gospel message of Jesus Christ. It got to the point where we were able to present truth in such a way that we could convince people, I think, to join us who really had no real connection to Jesus, no real commitment to him. And that's amazing. George Knight would go on to preach in his sermons and stuff. He had one he called Why I Don't Like Adventists. I know he said he had to stop preaching that because people didn't like that. He kept getting in trouble. But the idea is that if they were just Adventists, he had a problem with them. But if they knew Jesus, they were Christians who were Adventists, then that was fine. And the problem is that we would go out to preach our message of truth, and we begin by setting up debates. And the debate over it was popular, either State of the Dead or on the Second Coming, or the Sabbath. Sabbath was the favorite one. And of course people would come out for that, and that's how we would get interest in our meetings. And so we would debate the local pastor. Well, we got so good at debating, we began to debate ourselves. And so we find ourselves, by the time of the Minneapolis conference, to be now debating and arguing within our own ranks. The sanctuary conferences that formed and hammered out our main pillar doctrines really set us, though, on a solid ground. These 4 pillar doctrines we've never really had to capitulate from. We've grown from. We've learned a lot since, but we have not had to go back on them. And they are, of course, I use the 4 S's. Number 1, of course, is the sanctuary doctrine. The sanctuary doctrine involving the 2300 days, investigative judgment, etc. The seventh-day Sabbath, state of the dead, conditionalism, and then the second coming. So these were the 4 main pillar ones. I like, when I'm teaching this, to add a 5th one on spiritual gifts, and all of the spiritual gifts, tongues and everything. But usually this is to emphasize the spiritual gift of prophecy as we recognize in the ministry of Ellen White. But at least these 4 pillar doctrines are the ones in which form the foundation of our church that we have not had to go back on. Now, over the years, the focus tended to be, like I said, preaching on our distinctiveness. But now, we begin to ask the questions about who we were as far as Christians were concerned. So, in losing our voice regarding the gospel, we needed to find a way to get our voice back. Now, in 1856, Father Pierce had come down to Battle Creek, and Joseph Harvey Wagner had written a book called The Atonement. And in that book, he presents the law in Galatians, chapter 3 specifically, as the moral law. And Pierce had a problem with that because as Adventists promoted the Sabbath and the 10 Commandments as being continual, he felt that if that was the moral law there in Galatians 3, that it would somehow degrade or diminish the Sabbath, and that therefore we need to understand this not as the moral law, but as the ceremonial law. And this was a change that had taken place there within the church. Now I find that with this, before this change was made, people like Jane Andrews, James White, even conservatives more so like Joseph Bates and Uriah Smith understood that that was the moral law. But this was the big change that would come in to the church. And it would lead to a watershed event there at 1888, which was disastrous. So, what follows here, the major players at the 88 conference, is E.J. Wagner, who was the son of Joseph Harvey Wagner, born January 12, 1855. He was the 6th of 10 children. He had studied chemistry and anatomy at Battle Creek College in 1875. And then he and his new wife, they went west to the, there in California, to the Adventist Rural Health Retreat. After, in that, for a little while, he really had an interest for ministry and began to back away from that. And from that, he got a call from his dad, who was editing there at the Signs. He was the editor after James White's death. And he calls L.J. Wagner down to join him. So that was a big big step there that way. Alonzo T. Jones was born in Rock Hill, Ohio, April 21st, 1850. He was in the Army during the Indian Wars. He joined the Army in November of 1870. And so he found himself out at Fort Walla Walla. And out there, he and some other soldiers that were with him meet an Adventist preacher, I.D. Van Horn, and they were converted to Adventism. He became a preacher, ended up marrying I.D. Van Horn's daughter, and then a few years later got a call from the Pacific Conference Committee to come down and join Wagner there at the Pacific Press. And so now they would later then become the co-editors of the paper when Joseph Harvey left and went over to England. The other players we have is George Ida Butler. I wrote here that if anyone seemed destined to represent traditional Adventism, it was George Butler. At age 10, George went through the 1844 disappointment, was baptized by Andrews in 1856. He became well known as a tent evangelist. Butler was elected president in 1871, served until 74, and then again from 1880 to 88. But health issues, he was forced to retire from that and moved to Florida, late 1888. In his book, the late 20th century historian Emmett Vanderveer wrote that he says Butler was an administrator, that he had driven hard to inculcate the fundamentals of Seventh-day Adventism and had become a stickler for discipline. Butler himself admitted to having too much iron in his nature, but still strongly resented the attitude that certain fledgling ministers in California should feel equipped to challenge traditional SDA teachings. Of course, this is a direct reference back to Jones and Wagner. The other one that joined Butler in this criticism against him, the other side of the coin that is Uriah Smith, who was the editor of the Review and Herald. And many people in our church would recognize him simply as the author of Daniel and Revelation. But like Butler, Smith perceived Adventism to be under siege. And so now it was time to step up and defend the faith. Born in 32, he was 12 during the disappointment, and he joined the Adventist in Rochester in 52. And when they moved to Battle Creek in 55, he began to come on the mast as the editor of the Review and Herald. And essentially, except for a couple little points there toward the end, maintained that till his death in 1903. So the battle was essentially saying to be not just in the issues of righteousness by faith, but the real impetus, the real struggle between this was the issues in the book of Galatians. And so that's where we find ourselves. The pericope that we read is in Galatians 3:19 to 25. But the verse 24 is the one that really has it in for us. Therefore the law has become our tutor, our pedagogos, to lead us to Christ, so that we may be justified by faith. The law that would be our teacher to lead us to Jesus, is the ceremonial law, or is it the moral law? And later on we understand that Ellen White had understood that to be all law, both moral and ceremonial, this law itself. 84, Uriah Smith wrote, if it can be maintained that the distinction between the two laws does not exist, Sabbath keeping at once disappears from the list of Christian duties. Very important in Adventism to maintain the distinction between moral law and the Ten Commandments. And the temple ceremonial laws. So this is what led, for instance, in 1876, the writing of a little pamphlet on the two laws by Dudley M. Kenwright. It's very interesting that that's the person who wrote it, because he would leave Adventism in February of 87. This was not long after the 86 conference, just before the 88 conference. And the reason being is that it was over the very issues that was going to come to a head in 1888. You see, Dudley Kenwright believed Jones and Wagner. I should say, finally believed them. And in that belief, he could not reconcile his understanding then of the gospel with what he had been teaching in Adventism. and so he overthrew Adventism, resigned, and joined with the Baptists. In 1856 is when the Father Pierce comes in and changes all this for us. And so Smith and Butler later believed that Ellen White had a vision regarding his historical episode of Father Pierce coming down, and wrote to Harvey to confirm that the law was the ceremonial law. And so this is why Butler and Smith had this idea that Ellen White supported them and that it was a ceremonial law. But it was a little different. James and Ellen White had some different ideas about this thing. James White had been shown a picture by John Harvey Kellogg's brother, Merritt Kellogg. Merritt Kellogg had gotten the 6-month degree for being a doctor, and he headed west with a wagon and a couple ox, and his plans was to get out to California, and he found the retreat out there, and he helped establish that and bring the medical work to California. He showed him a picture that James White was very impressed with, and he published it there in 74. The name of the picture was called The Way of Life, and actually the total name was, it's an allegorical picture showing the way of life and salvation through Jesus Christ from paradise lost to paradise restored. And 2 years later, in October of 76, it was first published in 74. In October of 76, it was revised a little bit. They took the Eye of Horus out from the law tree. And then, not long before his death, he began planning another revision where he would emphasize the death of Christ on the cross, not the law tree in the picture. But because of his untimely death, he wasn't able to complete his work. But Ellen White picked up the project and finished it, and published a new picture in 1883. So we have within her work this progressive idea about the gospel, about justification by faith, about salvation, where the emphasis was upon Christ and not upon the law. And this is the tensions that we've been battling throughout our denomination from almost the very beginning. But here in 1888, as it begins to come to a head, you think we would be able then to move forward with that, to give the message. This was at the time of the Blair Sunday Law. And so we, according to Butler and Smith and others, we were right on the cusp of the second coming of Christ. We were now a small, insignificant denomination about ready to step upon the world stage to bring about the last message and herald in the coming of Christ. This was not a time to falter. But yet, this was the idea that Butler and Smith had, that what was going on. Because at this time, we're not only debating the issues of the law in Galatians, but Alonzo T. Jones has been coming in with his new teaching on the 10 horns of Daniel 7. Now I know that when Uriah Smith did his work, he did his largely based on what others had said when he made his list. But Jones did more of a historical study and decided that the Elemeni were the ones who should be on the list. And the Huns, who largely stayed back, should be taken off. So now, this change set up an uproar within the church. Now the problem is this, Uriah Smith wrote, he says, thousands would instantly notice the change and say, oh, now you find that you're mistaken on what you have considered one of your clearest points. And so if we give you time enough, you will probably come to acknowledge finally that you are mistaken on everything. And thus the tendency would be to unsettle minds upon all points, create confusion. That was his letter to Jones, November 8, 1886. The idea was that it wasn't so much the debate over the horns as it was setting up doubt among the people out there in the world who now were ready to hear the Adventist message at this time. And if we were wrong on that, what else were we wrong on? This is not the time to slip just before the coming of Christ. The 86th General Conference meetings, Butler had presented a little book that he wrote on Galatians, and he called the Law in the book of Galatians. Now, he had tried to write letters to Ellen White while she was in Europe, multiple letters, in fact, but she failed to respond to those. So it resulted in his declaration to make a brief comment, and that brief comment was an 85-page book he called The Law and the Book of Galatians. Now, in addition to what was going on here, Kenwright's little book on the two laws, published in 76, was reprinted in 86. And the section of the Law of Galatians was expanded from 6 pages to 24 pages. The 86 conference was to put Jones and Wagner with their quote-unquote false teaching in their proper place and put the church back on track. Kenwright was most likely the tragedy of the 86 conference, where he had resigned on February 17, 1887. Ellen White's response to the warring parties was that she said one of Ellen White's most important letters went to Jones and Wagner, dated February 18, 87, where she spoke about what she had written to Wagner, telling him that he was wrong. She could not, however, remember just what point Joseph Harvey was wrong on regarding his book on the Atonement. Also, she noted that Jones and Wagner were wrong for publishing their views in the Signs, and Wagner therefore withheld his book, The Law in the Book of Galatians, because of Ellen White's counsel. Or I should say the Gospel of the Book of Galatians, I'm sorry. She mailed a copy of this letter that she had written him to Butler, and Butler saw a victory in it. So he turned around and kind of shoved it down the throats of the boys. And he was saying things like how he always loved the two young men, took pity on those who suffered with such great disappointment. And then resulting from that, an article was published in the Review in March 22, 87, using Ellen White's letter. Ellen White was not impressed, so therefore she gave Wagner the permission to publish his book, which he did. Now, just before the Minneapolis meeting, Ellen White, who was having issues with Jones and Wagner and how they were debating this thing in the Signs, had called for a meeting there at her home regarding some of the issues on the Law in Galatians and the 10 horns. And so Jones and W.C. White and Wagner, they all gathered at her house, and this became known as the California Conspiracy because one of the pastors there in California, his name was William M. Healy, took this information, passed it on to the president, George Butler, and they made it sound like it was more of a conspiracy to set up what was going to happen in Minneapolis. And so Butler was ready for a fight. This resulted in his October 1st letter. He fires off this 40-page letter dated October 1, 1888. Of all the letters written, of the issues there, this stands as a very important letter. But you can see now that the battle lines are drawn. And when Ellen White caught wind of this, she says, we're in for it. And so they show up at Minneapolis with this cloud hanging over their head. She didn't have all the necessary loving accolades as she's had in the past. The view here, before we go back, is a paper called Three Paths to Minneapolis by Bert Holoviak, in which he talks about some of the positions that were being held at the time regarding this area. Uriah Smith, the editor of the church paper, along with Butler, and most of the pre-88 SDA ministry, held that justification involved primarily a means of obtaining forgiveness for sins of the past. Faith enabled adequate obedience and thus sufficient righteousness to pass the soon-coming final test. While sanctification thus overlooked justification, the latter was perceived as an objective transaction by the pioneers. Jones and Wagner's focus was upon the overwhelming dimensions of the law led to their conclusion that personal righteousness was inadequate, both for the past and for the future. Only the righteousness of Christ satisfied the requirements of the law, and such righteousness came through faith as a gift. Now in their schema, however, Christ's righteousness actually replaced the past sins within the individual and became the instrument of obedience for the present and the future. And so we see the dichotomies that were being led there. I highly recommend Holoviak's paper. The in Christ motif that we see developing here was in early '84, Ellen White systematically attempted to lead the church to a more elevated concept of the righteousness of Christ as a perspective that would energize the church. Her guidance provided the impetus that would likewise begin reformations concerning the nature of the SDA ministry and also modify its organizational concepts as well as its views of the basis for salvation. The Minneapolis message of justification. This is a material presented in Knight's book, A.T. Jones' Point Man on Adventism. This is the revision done in 2011 from chapter 5, The Meaning of Minneapolis, pages 65 to 82. So he writes out Minneapolis' message, and the first thing he asks is the question, was the message accepted? The rejection, you see point B on the page, that's page 13. The rejection of the message during the conference by many is well attested to. This was compounded by the controversy over other theological issues such as the 10 horns, and their own views regarding the reputations of the two men and Ellen White. Many during the 1890s confessed many of their errors, all or in part. Even the leaders of the resistance, Smith and Butler, made their amends. Now, this doesn't mean that they ever accepted everything taught at Minneapolis or that they ever learned to appreciate Jones and Wagner. The long Galatians continued to rub Smith and Butler the wrong way for the rest of their lives. It might be noted that there was no official rejection of the message at the conference, nor an official acceptance. It started and remained an individual issue, remains that way today. Wagner and Jones would continue on for the next decade under the administration of Olson and Irwin to receive wide support. They would be preaching at Bible institutes, various GC sessions. They became the golden boys of Adventism, even teaching at our schools, especially Battle Creek College. Jones would later become editor of the Review in 1897, and ironically, Uriah Smith, his antagonist, would become his assistant. Many, though, never responded to the message in a positive way, and this included some leaving the church. George Knight identifies several names, such as Harmon Lindsay, treasurer of the GC, who died a Christian Scientist. Clement Elridge, who managed the Review and Herald Publishing Association, also left, including Ellen White's nephew, Frank Belden, who also wrote a number of our hymns. Ellen White reported at the 1899 General Conference that the message had been accepted to a large extent, even as far back as '96, in a letter addressed to my brethren in America. She called for an end of the 3 to 5 month-long ministerial institutes which took our workers from the field. There was a time, she said, when this work was made necessary, because our own people opposed the work of God by refusing the light of truth on the righteousness of Christ by faith. But Taylor Bunch made a very interesting observation of the '88 message. He said that one by one of those who opposed the message began to accept it and even preach it, at least, theoretically. W.C. White went on with his letter to Taylor Bunch, stating that while the message wasn't generally rejected or repudiated, there remained no evidence of an entering into the experience, either by ministers or the people, to the extent God was calling for. And after a few years, without any open rejection or repudiation of the doctrine, a formalism and apathy prevailed. Even Ellen White noted that Jones himself was still not converted and had not experienced the application of the very message he had preached. Interesting statement published in 1926 by A.G. Daniels, the past president of the GC, read, "How sad, how deeply regrettable it is that this message of righteousness in Christ should, at the time of its coming, have met with opposition on the art of the earnest, well-meaning men in the cause of God." He says the message has never been received nor proclaimed nor given free course as it should have been in order to convey to the church the measureless blessings that were wrapped within it. Daniels quotes Ellen White from 1890 regarding the rejection of the message. And she wrote, "You will meet with those who will say, 'You are too much excited over this matter. You are too much in earnest. You should not be reaching for the righteousness of Christ and making so much of that. You should preach the law.' As a people, we have preached the law until we are as dry as the hills of Gilboa and had neither dew nor rain. We must preach Christ in the law, and there will be sap and nourishment in the preaching. There will be as food for the famishing flock of God. We must not trust in our own merits at all, but in the merits of Jesus of Nazareth." Then later, in December 27, 1890, she writes, "God calls men who will speak, who will cry aloud and spare not. God has raised up his messengers to do work for this time. Some have turned from the message of the righteousness of Christ to criticize the men and their imperfections, because they do not speak the message of truth with all the grace and polish desirable." So the question is, what is the 1888 message? There are no transcripts. If we recall Leroy Fromm's book, Movement of Destiny, he tries to establish that Wagner's wife had done the transcript. She had taken shorthand of the sermons. But that's not so. We found no evidence at all that had happened. And so there are no transcripts of the message. But there is a witness. And we have material from this witness. As George Knight notes, this witness is none other than Ellen White herself. And he writes her quoting from her there in a letter to O.A. Olson, May 1, 1897. She says, "The Lord in his great mercy sent a most precious message to his people through Elders Wagner and Jones. This message was to bring more prominently before the world the uplifted Savior, the sacrifice for the sins of the whole world. It presented justification through faith in the surety. It invited the people to receive the righteousness of Christ, which is made manifest to obedience to all the commandments of God. Many have lost sight of Jesus." And then she writes, "Centuries of ages ago can never diminish the efficacy of this atoning sacrifice. The message of the gospel of his grace was to be given to the church in clear and distinct lines, that the world should no longer say, Seventh-day Adventists talk the law, the law, the law, but do not preach or believe Christ." Wagner asserted that what he was preaching would bring us nearer to the belief of the Reformers. He did not regard his view as a new idea at all. Mrs. White noted that the message that was given to the people in these meetings, 1888, presented in clear lines not alone the commandments of God, a part of the third angel's message, but the faith of Jesus, which it comprehends more than is generally supposed. And it would be well for the third angel's message to be proclaimed in all its parts, for the people need every jot and tittle of it. If we proclaim the commandments of God and leave out the other half, scarcely touched, the message is marred in our hands. Now this was not new light. You know, she says, that precious light had been shown forth in connection with the law of God as the righteousness of Christ has been presented with that law. Dr. Wagner has opened to you precious light, not new, but old light, which had been lost sight of by many minds, and is now shining forth in clear rays. And she again notes that the point that had been urged upon my mind for years, she says, is the imputed righteousness of Christ. She says, I have wondered that this matter has not been made the subject of discourses in our church throughout the land, when the matter has been kept so constantly urged upon me, and I have made it the subject of nearly every discourse and talk that I have given to the people. The gospel of justification by faith was the central theme of 1888. It is both doctrinal and experiential. Ellen emphasized the imputed aspect to Wagner. The imputed aspect. To Wagner, justification always meant what it did to Augustine, to make righteous. Now both had based their understanding on the word from the Latin. For Wagner, it was Jesus in you, the eminent Christ. To Ellen, it was Jesus for you, the one from above. An 1888 message, though not complete, pointed the Advent people to Jesus, to a more balanced view between law and gospel. Largely not rejected but neglected by the people, has left us impotent and behind in proclaiming the message this movement was raised up by God to deliver. A movement called in time and place, but as the light begins to shine, Satan stole a march upon us to make us impotent. Have we lost our apocalyptic calling, or have we settled down to denominationalism? This message has been left to lose its power to change lives, and in place of it, a door would open to the development of a systemized theology of perfection some 40 years later. There remains a hope for us still to preach the uplifted Jesus. A gospel for such a time as this may restore the fire that had been missing in many levels of our denomination. The years leading up to the 1888 conference saw us touting what was Adventist in Adventism. After 1888, we've been trying to show the world what was Christian in Adventism. In many ways, we have not been succeeding. I think it's high time for us to find our voice, the voice that will restore the gospel in the Three Angels' messages. Thank you.